we'll get started. My name is Justin Williams. I'm the technical trainer here at MediaBeacon. And I've been with the company for about 12 years, and I wanted to spend a little time today talking about content pools, what they are and what they can do in a little more detail than the last webinar we talked about them briefly in. I just want to let everybody know again that I will take questions at the end, and let's get started with our presentation for today. So here's what our agenda is going to be. I'm going to cover what is a content pool, some configuration settings that are used when we're setting up a content pool. We'll be taking a look at some search substitutions and some, which are a thing that you can use to, that are used in part of the content pool setup. We've got some examples that we'll take a look at, and also look at how we manage content pools and some scalability. And after that, we'll take some question and answer points. So let's go ahead and move right along here. So what is a content pool? A lot of people don't know really what they are, what they can do, and they are kind of different than what you would normally think some of the things in MediaBeacon can do. So is it something magical, or is it more of a dynamic classification? If you guessed A, no, it is not a Sampo. It is not the mythical device of Finnish folklore. Of course, we're all very familiar with Finnish folklore, as I'm sure everybody is, or with MS23K. But it is not something that nobody understands how it works. I'm going to help you understand how content pools operate today, and we'll understand a lot more than it just being something magical. You'll be able to see how it works and how it can work for you. What a content pool is a dynamic classification that enables per user access to assets. So there, you can look at it in a couple of different ways. A content pool can be defined from the administrator's role. It's a per user setting inside the user account. It can also be looked at as specific asset metadata on a reference field, and it can be looked at as some advanced saved searches that are used to make the content pool operate correctly. From the asset perspective, we can look at a content pool as just a metadata value, and something either is or is not a member of a content pool when it's tagged or has certain metadata written to it. And I'll refer to this as the pool identifier value to help keep that clear. And we can also look at it from the perspective of users. Users can be part of a pool or not part of a pool based upon the settings in their user account. So this is one of the reasons there's a little bit of nomenclature confusion about the feature. So those are some ways that we might talk about a content pool. The specific areas that we're going to take a look at in terms of how you configure one of the configure a content pool. In the user accounts, we have something called content pools, and a little bit confusingly, it's a name-value pair. And where people can get kind of confused is that the name is really just a namespace. It is not the thing that identifies the content pool. It's more of a handle to use in something that's called a search substitution string, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The value is really the important part. That is what identifies the pool. I'm using some very arbitrary sort of code word-like values that are just unique. So if I was to tag an asset with a value of platinum lilac writestown, for example, that would sort of identify it as being part of a pool. And you can consider the name of the pool either the value name, which I think is easier to talk about, or you can kind of consider the pool the namespace. But because most people will, or at least will be tagging with those values, it's useful to think of this identifier as being quote-unquote the pool. Now, beyond this setting, which is in the user account, and we'll take a look at that in the interface in just a bit, we have to tag each asset with this value to identify it as belonging to that pool. So we'll have to create a field and set aside that field for the purposes of that's where the metadata is resident. It may or may not be something that's reserved for only content pool use. It doesn't have to, it's not a special field in any way. It's just a field that you will be using as what I call a reference field that the saved searches are going to reference. Also very important are the ACL settings. I'm sorry, the saved searches. So we will have to make a saved search that looks for this value, and we'll talk about that more in a sec. Whenever you're using content pools, it is very important to remember that you're going to have to make some ACL, probably at minimum, some ACL setting changes, or perhaps even view component settings. And we'll talk about that when we talk about some of the more advanced ways to set this up. One thing that I want to would really like to point out is that in MediaBeacon 2018 and 2019, we have conditional download as a just another ACL property that you can set. It is like a search filter, something that takes a saved search, and anything that is the result of that search is something that user is able, or all the users of that ACL are able to download. And when we pair this with a content pool, it can be a per user setting. So this is another thing that we'll talk about. Whoops, there we go. Yeah, just as I said, we do need to, when we add a content pool, usually it's to hide assets unless a user is part of a pool. And we do need to remember that however we use it, we're going to need to filter all functional groups for the contingency of the content pool existing. So it's kind of an add-on to all existing functional groups. So that's something to keep in mind. Just to give you an idea of a little less abstract example of where different parts of configuration are used. We have, in the user account, we have the thing that is defined in the interface as the content pool. We have the pool namespace, which just identifies the pool. And that becomes part of a special string we're going to use in our save search, called $user, pool, and then whatever string is the pool's namespace. The reference ID is just the string that's going to be tagged, and that's going to go inside of assets. And the ACL is going to get either a search filter and or a conditional download search filter, and we'll be using the saved search name for that. And of course, we've got a reference field that's going to be used in several different places. So there's a lot of interactivity, so you have to have 3 or 4 things set up in order to use the content pool that all are interconnected. I've talked quite a few times about these search substitutions and what they are. These are strings that exist in MediaBeacon. We had a number of them in version 8, in the 8 series, but in 2018 and 2019, we have expanded them quite a bit. Any of these property fields for contact information you have in the user account, most of them can be used. Phone extension is not used, but all these others can be used as a search string. When this is put into a search, what this will do is, instead of looking for the string, say, user LDAP company, it's going to say, hey, what's the current user, and substitute, in this case, the value MediaBeacon in the search. So it's going to look on a certain field for the value inside my user's company field, in this case, again, being MediaBeacon. Username is one that we can use, of course, and that's been around for a while. And also today, that's a date-based one, not specifically. But the feature that enables the content pools is this last one below here. And this one is a little bit different. It says pool instead of LDAP, and this allows the user to, the admin I should say, to configure a specific pool, since you can't have multiple pools per user, and identifies that pool. So although it says name and value here, you want to kind of think of, for example, the pool name kind of being like one of these strings and the value being the value of one of these strings here. So that's kind of how it works with regards to being used as a search substitution. All right. We're going to take a look at some examples here, and I'll just give you some information on how this is set up within my system. I have a field, just a reference field called view pools, and this is a standard string multi-value field that I can put various different values into, and that identifies the pools to which an asset belongs. The ACL that I'm going to use here is called Content Pools Basic, and I've made a search that is specifically going to the way it's set up is it is looking for anything where the view pools is, yeah, just a question. Yes, the session is being recorded. That's correct. So the view pools is there's no value. It's null, or the view pools contains. Again, here is our search substitution. So this will mean whatever value is in my user's view pools, not metadata, but my user account's value. So what this is going to do for me is it's going to let me see anything that isn't part of a pool and anything that is part of any pool that I am part of. If there are assets which are part of pools that I'm not part of, I wouldn't be able to see them. I've also combined this with conditional download as well. So we also have another reference field. I should have added it up here. But we have another field called download pools. And in this case, I can only download something if my user has a corresponding value in the download pools, content pools configuration. I'll show you a couple of different users here. One will have content pools, one will not. And I'm using some just arbitrary code words that I generated using an online thing, just so that they're all unique. So the pools to which this user belongs is Iron Pansy Willisburg, and download pools is Sylvie Iris McLean. So that's the membership that we have there, and you'll see the effect here. So I'll jump into MediaBeacon. And I'll jump into, first I'll go into my normal admin account so we can see what's really the case, what really exists. So for the purposes of this particular demonstration, all the content that you're going to see lives inside of this particular folder, and there are 28 total assets. Because I'm a global admin, I'm not restricted, I can see everything that's inside of this folder. We have the contents separated into 3 business groups here, and that'll come into play with one of our more complex examples as we go on. But we'll see that for different users in different situations, the amount of assets that are visible are going to deviate from that list of 28 different assets. So I'm going to log out and log in as a different user here. And I'll use user B. This user is part of no particular pools. And in the content pools webinar home, this one is not filtered. The ACL does not contain any search strings. So we're not using content pools in this ACL. But when I switch over to the example basic one, we're going to see that although the user cannot tell we are now being filtered by the content pools and any other ACL restrictions. So the ACL is limited to be inside of the webinar folder. And as you can see here, view pools, it doesn't show that there are any pools there. And that's because the user can't see them, so all the assets the user can see are not part of any pool. So these are assets without any pools at all. Now, this user is still subject to the download pools functionality here. So this user is not part of any pools. So although these various different assets, some of them are in pools and some of them are not, the user can't download anything. So the user, in this case, has to be part of a specific pool in order to make any kind of download. When we switch over to our user that is part of content pools, called user A, and we move into the filtered, we can see that we have some more assets here. For example, specifically, these three assets are tagged with the Iron Pansy Willisburg, which is the view pool to which this user belongs. Now, you'll also notice that you see a couple of the view pools down here. And the reason that you can see these is because in these cases, this asset, as we can see right here, is part of three different pools. So the user would be able to see those values if you expose the field and you to the user either in a metaform or in something like a search filter. So if it is important that users don't see those values, for example, you may wish to not include that particular field to the user. Sometimes this is sensitive information that might reference a non-disclosure agreement or something like that that you wouldn't want any other users to see. So that's a big determinant on whether or not you want to have your users even able to see what pools they're in. And the same thing also goes for things like group ownership and stuff like that. But I did it here so it's going to be very obvious to you how this operates. So that takes care of seeing that we can see some more assets when I'm part of a pool. But I want also to be able to download a few things. And things that are specifically tagged with this particular value, these are things that I can download, but not everything. Some of these other assets I can't download at all, but this one I can because this asset contains a value that I have in my download pools. And this is pretty easy to show how this is configured. So I'm going to just jump out of a user account and into an admin account to just give you a quick idea of how that's configured. So when we take a look at the configuration in this particular ACL, we can see that I'm being filtered on a particular route path, which is where all the assets were. And we also have a search filter being used here, so that's the view pools, and the conditional download, that's download pools. So these three things together in this case are what is giving rise so far as the ACL is concerned, to that behavior. So far as the user is concerned, those of you who have attended my trainings recently have probably seen this. If you haven't, it is, again, new to 2018 and 2019. Content pools are repeating data blocks of data, and again, we have a name-value pair, and they just live at the bottom of the contact info. And I can add as many of these as I want to, but I would say that practically speaking, what you're probably going to want to do is to have one for the purposes of viewing and one for the purposes of restricting your download if you want. There are other ways to configure this where each pool might be considered a different name, but I think it's easier to build fewer searches that are more dynamic using this kind of setup. So Let's just, speaking of those saved searches, let's take a look and see how they're actually composed. Now, in my case, I used the admin search functionality. Again, that's new to 2018 and 2019. Admin searches are only visible to administrator users, so normal users would not see these. And if we take a look at the search that composes the view pools, I'm using a field called view pools. It's just named that. It could be anything. It doesn't have to be corresponding to name at all. But to show users assets, I want them to see anything that is not part of a pool or things that are specifically part of my pool. So this value in this particular search for user A is, of course, going to be that Iron Pansy Willisburg value. And because user B didn't have any value there, they don't get to see anything extra. And download pools is a little simpler. I don't have to go to quite that extreme. And it's just whether or not download pools, a field, contains the download value. So I want them, so in this case, downloading is more restrictive than being able to see assets, which is usually how things would be set up. All right, so that's kind of our basic example. The next example here is taking this to kind of the next step, which is usually we're in not necessarily a multi-tenant environment, but we're in a situation where we have lots of different business groups or departments within an organization, and assets belong or are shared with different groups. And this very much calls back to the ACL webinar we did a couple of months ago, using my example of a way that I like to do this, and you can take a look at that webinar for a little more information on it. We have it on our website, MediaBeaconUniversity.com. But what we're going to do is we're going to add group filtering. So the search that we're going to be using, the group unby contains, I just arbitrarily assigned us to a group called Dr. Zeus, or groups they're shared with contains Dr. Zeus. So other groups can share their assets with us. So one thing that you have to remember when you start combining different searches, we have two searches here, and normally what I could do is, because they're both or, I could use a couple of different techniques to build an advanced save search and save it using the status panel. But one thing to remember is, and I'll show this to you when we jump over to, and we'll jump over to the webinar page. So in this case, I'm just loading the search, download pools search. And as you can see here, it says download pools and it equals my search string. The reason this is showing is because I don't have a value. The global administrator does not have a value because they're not restricted to a pool. The problem is if I was to save this search using the status panel, the value would become frozen. It wouldn't be dynamic anymore. So to get around that particular limitation, we use a slightly different technique, and I'll show you what that looks like. So we'll log back in as user A. And what I've done is I have two different infinite scroll components here. One being just a regular one with no special filtering. The other is the one that uses my Dr. Zeus filter, for example, to filter the view just for this particular view component, and that's called mandatory search. As you can see, the user doesn't know that they're being filtered because I've hidden the criteria. Normally they would show up here. I can simulate the same thing. We get 9 total results because I have a couple of assets here shared from Massive Dynamic and one from Yoyodyne here. If I jump back to the unfiltered view here, we can see that when I'm basically adding this search. Group is owned by Dr. Seuss or contains, or group shared with contains Dr. Seuss. So I am using this search as a mandatory search and hiding it so the user doesn't know that there's 2 different searches going on. So I'm able to combine using group-based searches, which is something we use extremely typically for many, many different customers. That's how you can combine them together. But you do have to keep in mind that if you are using a search substitution, this applies to any search substitution, not just ones specifically the content pools. But if you do use them, oops, that is not the right kind of user, so they can't see those searches. They have to be done as an advanced search. You can't take the results of an advanced search and combine them and save them as a search status type of search. It unfortunately makes the value non-dynamic. So that's one limitation, but we do have some tools to get around that, so it's not too big of a deal. All right, so the last thing that I kind of wanted to point out here is that we can go above and beyond just a simple name-value pair. And we can have or rather that name-value pair, I mean, it still is name-value pair, but I can have multiple terms. And it is a little bit of a quirk of the configuration that in order to do this, we would write the multiple values as an array, and it has to be in this particular format. It has to be surrounded by square brackets. Each term has to be in quotes and separated by a single comma, no space between those values. In this case, I just have 2, but this is giving user C, in this case, access to both values here. So the user is going to be able to download more and view more. So I'll show you what that looks like here. And the user that can use that is user C. And when we take a look at the filtered ACL here, we can see that there are 16 assets. There are more than would normally be allowed. And the user, while they can't download this other value of Platinum Lilac Rights Town, they will be able to download some of these other assets. So that's one of the ways that we can extend the capabilities of the user. So that's something that is very often used in the case of using content pools to manage rights. A good example of this as a use case would be we would have our users, so each of them would have a view pool and they would have a download pool. And I'll just jump back to the user configuration interface so you can just visualize that a little bit. But if we're going to use this for, say, a rights portal where users would have access to view a certain set of assets and then to download another set of assets. And what's really great about this approach is, Iron Pansy Willisburg is just a random value, but this can, of course, correspond to, say, a particular contract ID, however that would be identified, saying, My contract for large conglomerate company. So you have access to a particular character, for example, that your company has the IP rights to. And you would allow that user perhaps only to view those assets, but not maybe to download them, depending on the nature of that contract. So if the user does have access to use that particular character, you'd put that value in the view pools array and as well as the download. And we'd want to make sure that those assets were properly tagged in both of these on both of these fields called view pools and download pools. They correspond just so that it would be easy for you to see here. They, again, don't have to correspond. They could be different. It's just that the values are going to be what's identifying those. And then properly tagged assets for those characters would correspond to those contracts. And then you would be able to, your users be able to log in and download those assets as they would need to, for example. So this is a way that it can be, we can allow users to have very specific access per user rather than having group proliferation. As you saw, everything that I did was within one group, and although I technically was using two different ACLs, only one of them really came up, and that's the only one that's actually filtered. I was going to make a different ACL for basic, intermediate, and advanced, but I realized I didn't actually have to. A lot of that functionality is going to rest upon the shoulders of the user account or perhaps even different components. You'd have something a lot more locked down, obviously, than I do. You probably wouldn't show the user all that metadata, but instead of having a group for any different one of those pools, I can just have one group and one ACL. I don't actually need these others to create this effect. So those are our examples that I've got, and how we can provide this really specific access without having to have lots of groups and or ACLs, which can be very, very handy. The last thing I want to talk to you about today with regards to how we can use this in a real deployment sense is how we can manage the users and how this works for scalability. Now, this is a great benefit because I don't have to add lots of more groups, which means that if I'm in a situation where my users are logging in using some kind of identity management, just some identity provider, an LDAP, OpenAuth, Active Directory. Oftentimes it's quite a pain to get an identity provider manager to be constantly swapping what groups people are in. So this is another way to provide that access. So how would I manage something like a bunch of different contracts? Now, one really nifty thing about 2018 and 2019 MediaBeacon is that this admin core that we're inside, that shows the user accounts, is, of course, actually its own little MediaBeacon in the background. And all of these lines that you're seeing here are assets. And the metadata of these assets give rise to the configuration of the web UI. So that means that I can use some standard MediaBeacon tools. So if I wanted to edit something in common about different users, I can do that using our bulk edit functionality. A couple little quirks I want to point out. Sometimes you'll see that certain values in these fields are going to automatically be set. You will likely not necessarily want to change those if you're doing something like just managing the content pool. So watch out for that and make sure that those are turned off. When you see the no action icon, that's what you'll want to see, and only act upon those fields that you want to. Now, content pools is a repeating data block structure. So it's a little bit different than just editing a value right here. Most multi-value data is kind of unique because I would normally be able to, for example, if I were to say group membership is webinar, I can say either add this to the selected user's group membership field or remove just that value. And that's a really, really powerful feature that I can do. But repeating data blocks are a little bit different. I'll give a quick example here. So let's say that I want to add a particular content pool to my selection. I'll just use one user, but this would apply equally to a large selection. So I can go to bulk edit, turn off these, and I'll add a content pool, and I'll call it, and I'll make the value something like that. And we can see that this allows me to add and delete, but it adds and deletes the entire data block at once. And it's also going to do that for any data blocks that you specify here. So it doesn't do each one separately. It's going to do the whole block, the whole set of blocks that you enter here as one action. So just be aware of that. So when I add this user, add this pool to this selection of users, we're going to see that that is updated. And we have target 3 right there. So that one gets added. The things that I am going to have, that I don't have the ability to do with regards to changing values is if I'm in a situation where I have an array, for example, I can't go in and remove part of that array. I have to remove the entire block and, for example, add another one in order to edit that effectively. So if I'm going to remove a block, what I will need to do is, again, use the bulk edit. And, of course, this can be across many different users. But I would have to name that, I'd have to put the data in for the content pool exactly and say I want to delete that one. And I will be able to delete just that one chunk of the repeating data block. And once that's done, you can see that just that one content pool has been removed, not all of them. So you can remove them, but you have to know the exact values inside each content pool chunk. The other thing that is a little bit different than standard searching, standard things with regards to the content pools is content pools also don't really display in our search filter over here. So if I wish to find a content pool, I can do that, but it's going to act a little bit differently depending on whether or not you have. You can look for the string of the name or the value, but it's a little bit different. So if I type in just the string titanium tool at Summit, it'll find a content pool that has an array that contains it. But if I want to find an array that is specifically 2 values, I'd have to type that in as 2 values separated with just a comma, and then it will find that particular, or any user that has a content pool that has those 2 values in one particular array. So a little bit different than the searches that you're used to using just because of that bracketed data structure. So those are a couple things for management. So as you scale up in users, using these techniques will help you to be able to maintain those users in a larger sense. which gives you a lot of autonomy on the MediaBeacon application side, rather than having to rely upon a IDP staff to do these changes for you and to maintain many groups with lots and lots of different saved searches and things like that. So that's just something I want to mention on that management scalability. We've just got about a minute left before we break for our question and answers. I just wanted to kind of point out that typically some things to keep in mind. Users don't switch to different content pools. They're just settings that are inside the user. Now, you could go to a very advanced configuration in which you might have the user able to access different groups or ACLs that had very different filtration rules. But if you wanted to have a standard pool or a standard set of pool identifiers, and you want to have different behavior for users in different groups or ACLs, you'd need to build different searches that would or would not include those values, and you might need to create separate pools that contain similar values in order to have those different effects. So if someone has the rights in one group to download two different content pools, you might in another group give them, even though the data is on the same exact field, you'd have to come up with a different download content pool, just name it slightly different and make a new search given that new search substitution string. And the other thing is that users don't necessarily know that they're being filtered in this way. I think ideally the user, this is going to be entirely invisible to them. So to them, this is just going to be their experience, but it will be very different than anybody else who has different content pools. I don't think it's a complete, you still have to have a group and ACLs, so it's certainly not a replacement for those. But I'd say it's a big way that we can augment some of the functionality of those structures in MediaBeacon. All right, so I'm going to open it up to any questions that we have. You can unmute yourself and use the voice chat, or certainly type into the text chat, and I'll take any questions that you have about either content pools or anything else about MediaBeacon, or perhaps even any suggestions for future webinar topics. I'm certainly open to any of that. So I'll turn it over to you guys, and I'll give everybody a few minutes to ask some questions that you might have.
Hey, Justin.
Yes, hello.
It's John Vernon from Pivot Point. Quick question for you.
Yes.
Is there a way of using, and I'm sorry, I jumped in a little bit late here. I was on another call. Is there a way of using content pools to only allow certain users to see certain documents rather than, I mean, for example, if we have a user in an ACL that points to a certain directory where they can see everything in that directory, is there a way of making that, for lack of a better word, a null search? So if I'm a user in that area and I have a tag on a document, I cannot see that document?
Absolutely. That's exactly the point of the content pools. Again, I'll just jump back into our example. So,
and I'm sorry if you went through this, I jumped in late.
Oh no, absolutely. It's if you're interested, and I want to make sure that you get to understand what these functions are and what they do. So user A is my primary example here, and I have two ACLs here. The only difference between them is that one is set up to filter using the content pool searches. Mm-hmm. So in this case, there are 28 total assets that an unfiltered user would see. So something like a global administrator. When we move over to the basic one, you're going to see that although I'm in the same exact spot, I only see 16.
Okay.
And the reason I can see the things here is because they don't have the view pool, which controls whether something is visible or not, those assets don't have any data there. For example, I can see that these assets are not tagged. View pools is empty value, so I'm able to see them.
Okay.
If these assets specifically right here, the ones that, this is the view pool that my user is part of, and the user gets to see these extra things. Now, that's certainly one way to do it, but you could make that search inverse. You could say that if an asset is, you could have the content will be exclusive rather than inclusive. So what you would do for your saved search is on my view pools field, I can say that if the view pool contains the value that's in my user, so that's normally what we do. That's an inclusive search, but I can also say it's exclusive. So if something is tagged, say, NDA, and this user, I can designate that pool as being NDA, and this search would result in the user not being able to see things that are tagged a certain way. So yes, that's a very good question. You can have the search, and it's all about how the search criteria are built. You still would tag users, you'd add users to pools in the same way, and you'd also tag assets. It's just you would think of the pools as being exclusive rather than inclusive, and you'd set your searches up sort of in the inverse. So yeah, you can totally do it that way. That's a very good question.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else from anybody?
Justin, JP, what's your recommendation on depending on how many users we would have, how many groups, what's a good balance to manage that with content pools at user level, or to manage the same restrictions or visibility at group level?
My general recommendation, as always, is wherever you possibly can, avoid proliferating groups where you don't need them. There are sometimes users who, or some admins, I should say, who will end up setting up many very similar ACLs, which are almost identical in terms of things like privileges, permissions, and things users can do, but they want to separate users between groups of content. And that's certainly something that you can do using an ACL, but to avoid having tons of those, you can use content pools to reduce some of that number. In terms of what the best recommendation for the the best way to do that is, I think, how often do you change the content pools? How often does a user move between different content pools? Is that something that's constantly changing, or is that something that's kind of a set it or forget it sort of thing? The set it or forget it thing is really kind of more geared towards things like groups. But again, that comes with perhaps having to set up a lot more groups depending on what your complexity is. If you're changing what content pools users belong to a lot, it just means that you're going to need to have some users that are well trained in how to do that user content pool editing, so that they're able to manage that. So it will require someone who's going to be managing that to move people between different content pools. Now, of course, this also has a little bit of bearing on the metadata that exists inside of assets. It's very easy to move an asset between content pools just by metadata, but hopefully that's something that you're doing anyway, with even just regular ACL and group filtering. So I'd say that you can certainly go for a hybrid approach, but if you have the need to move people around to different content pools on like a daily or weekly basis, I think you're going to need to have sort of an expert who's assigned to manage that and keep track of it. So I think it really becomes about sort of manpower and how you want the administration and management to go. So that's a very good question. Does that provide you some insight?
Yeah, thank you.
If anybody has any other, say, examples of topics that they would like to cover in future webinars, that's certainly something that we'd love to hear. This webinar itself was a suggestion from our previous monthly webinar. So that's we want to be covering the topics that you want to hear about, and things like that. So we just got a lot of voices that said we really want to more understand content pools better. So that's something we're definitely trying to listen to your voice on. Thanks very much, everybody, for attending today, and I will see everybody next month with a brand new topic. So thanks, everybody, and thanks for coming and watching.